Belize is not unique to the de-risking movements taking place with correspondent banking. With representatives present in Placencia for the intersessional meeting of the heads of government of CARICOM, we were able to hear from other member states and how they are being affected. Here is Renee Trujillo with that story.
The last few weeks have seen the local banking sector headlining the newscasts as the U.S. banks undergo the de-risking movements in the area of correspondent banking. While we have looked at the possible implications for Belize, and while the country's Prime Minister Dean Barrow has made moves to try and mitigate the problem, the 15 member states of the Caribbean community are also discussing the issue, as most of them are also being affected by the de-risking phenomenon. As the 27th intersessional meeting of the heads of government of CARICOM got underway with their meetings this morning, the Secretary General Ambassador Erwin LeBrock spoke on the general situation in the CARICOM region.
We've seen, we got a report yesterday, and just about every single member state is impacted. I believe the one that, from what I heard yesterday, that is probably the most severely impacted is Montserrat, our smallest member, but nonetheless, with having had two banks operating there, two corresponding relationships, one has now served notice, which means there's only one left. And if that one pulls out, then there'll be no corresponding relationship with Montserrat, which could really impact negatively on the economy in all sorts of ways. Of course, we know Belize and Antigua, a whole host of other countries are similarly impacted. We know that Prime Minister Dean Barrow was in Washington 2 weeks ago and met with the authorities, the regulators. And I'm sure he will also be informing his colleague heads on what transpired there.
The issues surrounding correspondent banking have not only been affecting countries individually, but rather collectively. For example, in Grenada, while they have not been impacted directly, the situation in Belize has created challenges for them, as explained by Ambassador Dr. Patrick Antoine, who is in Placencia as the CARICOM ambassador for Grenada.
In Grenada, we have not been as directly impacted through the banks as yet because we've already had some bank consolidation take place before that. What's happening though is that increasingly a number of our clients are being essentially delisted. A number of them are having their transactions stopped, and it's affecting tremendously cross-border trade in real estate, in investments, and in other such services. Because I also carry responsibility for, at the OECS level, for a number of the other countries, the most severely impacted country most people will not know is Montserrat. Montserrat has two banks. One of them has actually received notification that they're going to be delisted, which leaves only one. And that one is, the fate of that one is tenuous. What we're looking at is a very real prospect that a country like Montserrat can be delinked, totally delinked, will have no relationship in terms of getting financial transactions processed going out or coming in. That's a tremendously difficult place for a country to find itself. Grenada has been impacted directly from transactions coming through Belize. And until this happens, you don't appreciate the fact that the financial network, the mesh in global finance is so heavily integrated. And that has also led to a number of transactions in Grenada that couldn't go through. Not because clients didn't have funds, not because there was no interest or no contract, but just because you couldn't get the funds out of your financial system into other banks, no corresponding banking relationships. We're in a very dangerous place in CARICOM, and I think this certainly calls for us to wrap our heads around this in terms of concerted action. The approach that Belize took tells us that going it alone is not necessarily the route, but it also tells us something else. What we need to do is to put the question to the United States, and I think in the question that in the session we had yesterday that came out, we need to put the onus on the United States to tell us what regulations we've transgressed or what regulations we appear that we're going to transgress, secondly. And then they have an obligation to tell us how are they purporting that these limitations are cured. And I think that is one of the things we need to do. Now, not just at the federal level, it's also at the level of the regulators. But the federal government has a responsibility also to deal with its regulators. So it can't just be us talking at different levels of the US system. We have to be talking at the federal level, at the operational level, with regulators, with banks, and I think we've certainly learned a lot from that. So in going into the next phase, which is really at the Marsh in Jamaica, we really need to wrap our heads around a comprehensive strategy that really now calls out the United States and calls out the regulators on some of these matters.
Meanwhile, in St. Lucia, Ambassador June Sumer spoke of how they are affected, particularly because of the common currency in the OECS, which is the Eastern Caribbean currency. Sumer added that a harmonized approach on the matter has been decided on.
Because we have a common currency in the OECS, the Eastern Caribbean dollar, it's also affecting us, because if it's affecting Montserrat and the Bank of Montserrat, it's affecting us in St. Lucia. If it's affecting Antigua, as it is in the Bank of Antigua, it is affecting us in St. Lucia. So plus the fact that we have a number of indigenous banks in St. Lucia. So the issue of correspondent banks is something that we're looking at very seriously. We have been trying to do it as individual territories, and coming out of the task force that you spoke about, the main recommendation was for us to take a harmonized approach. And as we speak to the US and to Canada and to the UK, we are going with one set of decisions and one view as a Caribbean people.
Secretary General LaRocque says that since last year, the Caribbean community has begun taking action and the works will continue. He added that following these meetings, a more definitive approach and plan of action will be disclosed.
We started taking action, believe it or not, since last year, When heads of government met in the Bahamas last February, the matter was raised, the concern was raised. We immediately made contact with the U.S. government and the authorities. When we met with President Obama in April in Jamaica, that matter was discussed, and it has been raised subsequently in different areas. Now, more recently, the Prime Minister has been up to Washington, and we must continue that démarche on Washington, because it has to be both at the political and at the technical level that one must approach this matter. The meeting will be making some very specific recommendations to the heads of government in a course of action, and I believe once that the heads have considered them, we can then determine how we go forward. I don't think I'm at liberty to disclose them now, because the heads, it has to be presented to the heads first. But yes, very concrete plan of action of how we go forward.
As mentioned earlier, Montserrat is the most affected member state in the Caribbean community. Montserrat is the smallest member state, with only one bank left on the island that still retains correspondent banking. Reporting for Love News from Placencia, I am Renee Trujillo.